Episode 16, Part 07, Chapter 16. Chapter 16. Yuffie stood silently in the middle of the living room, her eyes focused on her hands as she twiddled her fingers nervously, unable to meet the angry gazes of the others. They were standing around her, waiting impatiently for her to return their materia to them. Once they had all their materia back, they could leave Wutai, and focus on searching for the elusive temple of the ancients. It was quite a nice house, certainly not the kind of home they expected someone as carefree and wayward as Yuffie to live in. It was actually one of the largest houses in Wutai, close to the entrance of the village. As with all the houses in the village, there were slide-open doors and cute little tables and cushions to sit on, and beds made on the floor behind paper walls. Wutai truly was a little world of its own. The young ninja didn't know what to say at first. Each time she tried to lift her eyes, they were met by an angry glare of impatience and frustration. She knew that there was no way she could talk herself out of this mess. The longer she waited, the more impatient those gazes became. So she took a deep breath and lifted her head.
"I know, the materia, right?"
she said, her voice trembling slightly.
"I have it stored in a safe place. Follow me."
Yuffie then turned and headed towards a side door to the north of the room. A set of stairs stood behind it, and Yuffie motioned to the group to follow her. The group hesitated at first. After all, Yuffie was a clever young girl, and no one really knew when she was being serious or plotting some other trick. But there were no other exits, so Yuffie really had nowhere else to go. They followed her down the stairs and into a basement beneath the house. It looked like some sort of storage room. There were a lot of weapons hanging on the walls, from spears to axes, and even a few shurikens lay scattered on the floor. The only thing that did seem out of place was a control panel at the far end of the room, with a screen that had the words "off" written on it in bold letters, and two levers on the panel in front of it. Yuffie waved to the others to enter the basement. They all came in as she waved to them, and gathered in the middle of the weapon storeroom. Once they were all gathered, they turned to Yuffie, expecting her to return their materia. Yuffie looked at them all hopefully for a moment or two, before she turned her gaze away and looked at the floor.
"I've been hearing that ever since I was little,"
she said suddenly. Everyone stopped and turned to her. Yuffie's voice was trembling slightly as she spoke, as though she was nervous or even a little upset.
"Before I was born, Wutai was a lot more crowded and important."
She paused for a moment and lifted her eyes so she could look into the gazes of the others.
"You saw what it looks like now, right? Just a resort town. After we lost the war, we got peace, but with that, we lost something else. Now look at Wutai. That's why. If I had lots of materia, I could."
The ninja stopped suddenly, her voice choking as a heartfelt sob entered her throat. Realizing this, Yuffie quickly turned and averted her gaze from them, not wanting them to see the tears. Even though she was unable to finish her sentence, everyone knew what she had been trying to say. If I had lots of materia, I could restore Wutai to its former glory. No one said anything for a second or two, absorbing the words of Yuffie's story. It was true that Wutai was simply a resort town now, despite how mysterious it was. There was no doubt that lots of materia would bring in enough money or power to bring Wutai back up into one of the top powers again. Even so, as much as some of the others were somewhat sympathetic to her story, they were not sympathetic enough to let her keep the stolen materia, no matter what the cause. Seeing the nods of agreement from the others, Cloud walked over to the sobbing young ninja and stood beside her, although he refused to look at her.
"Listen, Yuffie," he said, stern and uncaring. "I don't care about the history of Wutai or your feelings. You've got our materia and I want it back. Now. If you give it back now, we'll drop the whole thing." I know that,"
Yuffie said, still trying hard to choke back her sobs. Even so, a few salty tears rolled down her cheeks, and when she dared a quick glance at Cloud, he saw that her eyes were red. She looked at him hopefully for a few seconds more, before she turned away and waved her arm over to the control panel at the end of the room.
"That? Sniff. Switch,"
she mumbled quietly, her voice muffled through her hand and her tears.
"The lever on the left. Materias. Sniff, heek. In there."
Cloud nodded gratefully, and gave the ninja a small, comforting pat on the shoulder. Then he turned and walked across the room, towards the control panel. It was a very simple mechanism. There were no buttons, just the two levers sticking up out of the metal. Cloud assumed that when he pulled the left lever down, some secret hatch would open up and reveal their materia. Cloud reached out and closed his fingers around the lever. He hesitated at first and even wondered if maybe he should pull the right lever instead. Then he remembered the look on Yuffie's face and the sincerity of her tears. Maybe she truly was sorry for stealing the materia. This thought gave him the assurance that she was telling the truth, so he gripped the lever and pulled it down with a gentle click. That was then followed by the sound of a much larger click, followed by a very loud grating noise that came from the ceiling. Cloud was about to look up when Eris suddenly screamed loudly, her gaze already on the ceiling. Cloud spun around and looked up just in time to see a large grey cage suddenly drop down from the ceiling, and slam itself onto the ground around where the others all stood. Red 13 pulled his tail away just in time as the heavy metal bars struck the ground, and he turned around to face Yuffie with a fierce glare in his eyes.
What are you doing?
He snarled angrily.
Ha ha ha.
Yuffie jumped up and spun around to face the others trapped inside the cage. The tears in her eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a happy grin that only became wider as she saw the angry and surprised gazes of the others. Even though the metal bars kept them all trapped inside, she made sure she stayed clear of Red 13's vengeful claws.
Never trust anyone that easily,
she advised the group, the grin remaining wide, enforced by the sheer thrill of knowing that she had once again fooled them.
The materia's mine. Tough.
Without even so much as a wave, she quickly turned and ran out of the room, heading upstairs towards the door. When she was halfway up the stairs she stopped, a second grin spreading on her face. She sniggered to herself, and then turned and ran back down, standing in the doorway.
You want your materia? Then go find it yourself,
she snapped.
Yeah, that's right. And when you're looking for the materia, remember you gotta steal it. Heh. Steal. Steal. Get it? See ya.
This time she did wave, and then she turned and ran off the stairs again. The sound of her laugh echoed down the hallway, and the upstairs door slammed shut. Quickly Cloud turned back to the control levers in front of him, trying to decide which one would lift the cage and release the others. He had pulled the left lever to release the cage. Maybe moving it back into place would lift it back up again? He didn't waste any time mulling it over, for every second they wasted allowed Yuffie to run further and further away from them. He pushed the left lever back up, and a loud creaking sound signaled that the cage was being lifted up again. He turned to see that it was so, and the cage was gradually lifted from the ground and back up the ceiling. It was an amazing piece of machinery, but they had no time to wonder how they did not notice it when they came in. They had to catch up with Yuffie.
Let's go,
Cloud said. The others, now free of the cage that had trapped them, nodded. Cloud then led the way as he tore out of the room and darted up the stairs, his mind focused on catching the pesky ninja who had tricked them once again. The door to the house was wide open as they burst into the living room, a clear sign that Yuffie had once again fled into the safety of the village. Cloud tore out of the house and stopped, looking around for any signs of Yuffie nearby. The others came out just seconds later and stopped also, their eyes wandering around the northern part of Wutai, trying to spot the girl. They could no longer rely on the wind giving her scent away, for it had turned back to its original direction, carrying her scent away from them. It did not take them long to spot her. As their eyes fell on the northern bridge leading back towards the Turtle Paradise, they saw her standing on the bridge, pausing for breath. The moment they spotted her, she spotted them, and quickly took off again across the bridge. Determined not to let the girl out of their sight, Cloud and the others quickly followed her. Yuffie panted hard as she ran, putting all of her strength into her running as she tried to pull away from the advancing group. She pushed past one of the villagers as she passed the bridge, kicking up dust as she turned to dart across the western bridge. For a split second she became torn as to whether she should run left or right, for the path split into two. Going right would take her into the mountains, and going left would take her further into the village. That decision was quickly made for her, as she heard the sound of loud growling and snapping jaws close behind her. Making a quick decision, Yuffie swerved to her left, just in time, for as she turned a blur of red zipped quickly past her. She didn't stop or wait to see if Red 13 was still following her, and continued to run alongside the stream's edge towards the southern part of the village. Cloud and the others continued to run, beginning to lose distance again thanks to her sudden swerve back into the village. They had to skim past Red 13, who had been forced to make a sudden stop in order to avoid crashing into the wall of the item shop. As long as they kept Yuffie in their sights, they could follow her until they were able to catch her. Yuffie then broke into the southern part of Wutai, a wide open area containing a single large house and the tall pagoda that loomed like a watchtower over the village. Opposite the house there was a structure that looked like a shelter, with a single small bell dangling inside of it. Yuffie grinned and made another swerve, heading for the structure. The others entered the southern district too late. Yuffie was already one step ahead of them, leaping up the stairs towards the structure and the dangling bell. She didn't even pause as she jumped up and pulled hard on the string of the bell, making it ring loudly and clearly throughout the district. She then turned back and leapt over the wall, to where a small wooden door was just opening, leading into shadow. As she leapt over the wall, she turned and zipped straight through the door, closing it firmly behind her. Cloud got there just as the door slammed shut. He pushed hard against it, but it was already locked firmly from the other side. Furiously, he slammed his fist against the strong wooden frame. All he got in response to his punch was a manic, happy laugh, coming from the ninja from the other side. That laugh continued even as it faded away, meaning Yuffie was running off and making her escape. They had lost her.
Damn it!
Cloud shouted angrily. He stepped back and gave the door a hefty kick, but it was a hopeless attempt. The door was too strong and refused to budge, and he could no longer hear Yuffie's laugh.
Have we lost her?
Asked Eris. Cloud stopped kicking the doorframe and stepped back, running a hand furiously through his blonde hair, wanting to pull it out of sheer frustration. He took a breath, and looked up.
No,
he said, shaking his head.
We have to find a way to follow her. She managed to open this door, so we should be able to, as well.
He crossed his arms and tapped his foot.
How?
They all paused for a moment or two and thought it over. Somehow Yuffie had opened this door, but what had she done? There were no switches nearby, and they had looked around the inside of the structure for any kind of hidden buttons or levers that she could have pulled when they didn't see. They ran the whole scene over in their minds. She rang the bell, she jumped to the door. Everyone realized it at the same time, and 8 sets of eyes all turned towards the bell, which had stopped ringing and was now motionless on the ceiling. Yuffie had jumped up and rang the bell before the door had opened. It was the only way. The bell had to be the hidden switch operated to open the door.
The bell,
said Tifa, voicing everyone's thoughts. Vincent nodded in agreement.
It is the only possible assumption,
he said calmly.
Then let's try it,
said Sid. He pushed past Vincent and Kat and marched up the stairs towards the structure, and stopped beneath the bronze-plated bell. Up close he could see the mechanism, the number of small levers and cables that wound their way through the frame of the structure, most likely heading towards the door. Sid pulled out his cigarette and put it behind his ear, before reaching up and ringing the bell. It rang loud and clear, just like before, echoing throughout the southern district. Cloud turned to the door as the bell rang, hearing a soft click sound from just behind the door. He gently pushed on the frame, and sighed with relief as it opened easily at his touch. He signaled to the others before pushing the door open fully, and they stepped through into the darkness. It was dark at first since there were no lights, so they had to feel their way down a small set of stairs towards the bottom. There were sea lights at the end of the stairs, coming from a half-open door. As they approached they could hear the sounds of a scuffle, and a voice that could only be Yuffie's coming from the other side.
Let go. I said let go.
Cloud reached behind him and put his hand around the hilt of his sword, ready to draw it in an instant if there was trouble on the other side. He presumed it would be Reno and the rest of the Turks, taking their chance to capture Yuffie and lure the others into a trap. If this wasn't another of Yuffie's traps, that is. He cautiously opened the door, and they all looked inside. Sure enough, Yuffie was in that room, although she was not looking at Cloud or standing on the floor. She was instead up in the air, held up by the strong arms of a man in a black uniform. She was struggling fiercely, waving her arms and kicking her legs fiercely as she tried to break away. The man had a secure grip on her and she was unable to do anything. Down by the man's feet were her shurikens, thrown aside so that they were useless to her.
Hey!
Yuffie protested loudly. She tried to turn her head to look down at the man who was holding her, but all she could see was the top of his head.
Who do you think I... Ow!
She gasped as the man tightened his grip on the back of her neck.
What are you doing? Jerk!
Cloud stared for a moment, watching as Yuffie struggled even harder to break free of the man's expert grip. The man obviously wasn't a member of the Turks, they wore blue uniforms, not black. Cloud thought that maybe the man was a friend, until he caught glimpse of an unfortunately familiar figure standing behind him.
You!
Cloud narrowed his eyes and drew his sword, preparing for battle. Standing behind the suited man was a figure Cloud had hoped never to see again, and was sickened to recognize him. That bulbous body, covered up by the long red robe like something out of a royal fantasy. That bald head with its shiny crown. That sickening imagination that he was attractive, and irresistible to women.
Ho! Ho!
The man burbled from the back of the room. He looked up and gazed at Cloud, before a smile appeared on his face and he moved his tilted crown back to the top of his head.
Ho he, ho he. Ho ha he. Corneo!
Cloud exclaimed angrily. Tifa and Eris both groaned in unison, both of them as dismayed as Cloud that they had encountered Don Corneo again. The others looked around, confused. They had first met the repulsive Don Corneo back in Midgar. He had been the top man in charge of Sector 6, the Wall Market district of the slums. When they had met him, he had been living in luxury, managing the Red Light district and the Honeybee Inn, looking for a bridge. Thanks to him, Cloud had been forced to dress up as a woman in order to rescue Tifa, and following that, Sector 7 had been destroyed. All because he had blabbed about the whereabouts of Avalanche. He truly was a sick, self-obsessed individual. They had left him in Sector 6, but never thought for even a second that he would turn up in Wutai.
Ho he.
Corneo said cheerfully, giving them a little bow. He stood upright again.
I've finally got a new chickie. 2 for 1, in fact. Ho he, ho he.
Cloud stared.
2.
He asked. All he could see was Yuffie, still being held up by the man in the black suit. Then he looked towards the stairs at the far end of the room, and saw what Corneo meant by 2. Up on the stairs was another man in a black suit. In his arms was another woman, being held up above his head just like Yuffie was. Everyone gasped as they recognized this woman, too. The blonde hair and that blue suit were just unforgettable. Elena of the Turks.
Hey! Let go of me!
Elena shouted fiercely, her arms pinned to her sides by the second man's equally strong arms.
You're gonna regret this!
The second man didn't seem to be listening to her, and just let Elena continue her pointless struggle. Corneo didn't seem to realize that she was a Turk, and anyway, by herself, Elena could not do much to stop him. It was in fact very clear that Corneo did not know that she was a Turk, for he was grinning happily with absolute excitement.
Ho he, ho he. Ho ha he.
He snorted, almost jumping from the sheer thrill of having caught 2 ladies at one go. He then gave a little wave and darted up the stairs towards another door, his 2 men following him close behind. Corneo glanced back as he ran through the door, waving farewell as he burst through the door. He came out on the other side, on the ground floor of Wutai's local inn. As he ran through he turned his head back to the front, and rapidly skidded to a stop as he saw what was standing in front of him. In the middle of the room were a fairly large number of blue-uniformed Shinra soldiers, each one suited up and ready for battle. They seemed surprised when the back wall of the room opened up and Corneo came dashing through, but once that momentary surprise was over they each quickly drew their guns and other weapons. Then they all aimed for Corneo.
There he is! It's Corneo! Don't let him get away!
One of the officers barked. Corneo looked around the room hurriedly, trying to find a way out of the mess he had gotten into. He heard the angry cries coming from behind him, and suddenly smiled, coming up with an idea. All of this took about 2 seconds, as he turned back to the soldiers.
Ataok!
The soldier barked again, his gun raised to the air. The 2 sides collided in an instant, and the soldiers and the opposing group both tumbled forward into a big heap on the floor. When Cloud opened his eyes he found himself staring into the dark mask of a Shinra soldier's helmet. He could see his own reflection clearly, as well as the faint, blacked-out eyes of the Shinra soldier who was shielded behind it. He saw those eyes stare blankly for a second, before they narrowed into an expression of fury. End of chapter. Episode 17, Part 07, Chapter 17. Chapter 17. Quickly Cloud jumped up onto his feet, his hand already behind him to draw his sword. He pulled the sword out in a single, swift movement, and kept moving so that the wide blade swung around towards the startled soldier. The flat side of the blade struck the soldier's helmet before he could even think about picking up his gun again. The sword connected with a loud crack, and the soldier crumpled into a heap onto the floor. The rest of the Shinra soldiers did not waste any time in making up their minds whether to attack or not, and quickly rushed to pick up their guns from the ground. Although their orders were to catch the KG Don Corneo, they also had orders instructing them to capture Cloud and his comrades whenever it was possible. As it turned out they were all too slow, as Cloud and the others were already up and moving before their hands could even reach their weapons. It was all over in just over a minute. Soldiers went flying through the air, crashing through the thin wooden walls into neighboring rooms as Tifa picked them up with her fists and slammed them into the wall. Guns clattered and schemed across the ground as Cat Shi jumped up on his Mog body and pounced straight on top of one of the soldiers, flattening him beneath his massive bulk. Barrett and Vincent did not dare to fire their guns in such a confined space, but that didn't stop them from grabbing the soldiers and throwing them aside to Sid, who caught them with his spear and also hurled them to the ground as though they were nothing. One of the Shinra soldiers tried to make a break for it during the fray. The door to the room was open, and this one soldier saw an opportunity to slip through while the others were preoccupied in their fight. He saw his chance and took it, darting across the room between the soldiers, heading for the door. Eris was standing at the back of the group then, and saw the soldier rushing towards the door. In an attempt to stop him, she threw her staff across the room, trying to block his path. The staff caught the soldier and became entangled in his ankles, causing him to trip up and fall onto the floor. Eris then quickly jumped over another fallen soldier, moving fast before the soldier could get up again. She picked up her staff as it schemed across the floor, and brought it down swiftly onto the soldier's head. The glass mask smashed and the soldier fell onto the floor, not about to get up again after a blow like that. After that minute was over, all of the soldiers were either unconscious or incapacitated, some of them groaning and crawling pathetically across the ground. It was pointless killing the soldiers. After all, it wasn't the soldiers they were after. It was Don Corneo that they were after now, and the precious cargo that he had taken from them, the precious cargo being the one person who knew where their material was hidden. Tifa stopped and looked around the room. She expected to see Don Corneo in a corner, shivering and quivering like a scared rat at their might and strength. Yet as she glanced around she saw that he was nowhere to be seen. The only people in the room were themselves, excluding the defeated soldiers.
"Where is he?"
she asked aloud, breaking the silence. Everyone looked around at the room, although they knew that Don Corneo had already gone. He had slipped out at the beginning of the battle, using the fray between the soldiers and Cloud's team as a diversion so that he could escape unnoticed. There was also no doubt in their minds that he had taken Yuffie and Elena with him, since there was no sign of them or the two men carrying them. Cloud walked briskly towards the open door, stepping over the unconscious soldier as he did so. He looked briefly down the corridor leading out of the room, and saw that it was empty.
"He can't have gone too far,"
he said to the others. He slipped his sword back into its hilt behind his back.
"Red 13, can you pick up his scent?"
The hound jumped over to Cloud and sniffed the air, trying to catch the scent. There were 5 separate scents in the air, 2 of which belonged to Yuffie and Elena, he could tell, and he guessed the other 3 belonged to Don Corneo and his 2 henchmen. All of these scents led down the corridor, most likely towards the exit. With a gruff growl he leapt past Cloud and began to jog lightly down the corridor, growling at the others to follow him. The others did follow, running in single file down the thin corridors as they tried to keep up with Red 13. Their boots made loud and heavy thuds against the wood, drowning out their heavy panting. Red 13 led the way, his head always lifted to the air to catch Yuffie's scent as it drifted past him. The building that they were in was an inn of sorts, clearly different to the inns they had visited during their journey. There were a number of slide-open doors along the corridor, each leading to fairly identical rooms. But Red 13 wasn't interested in these, since Yuffie's scent wasn't coming from any of them. He knew that her scent was leading him towards the entrance, where hopefully they would catch up with Corneo before he ran too far ahead of them. The entrance was just ahead now. Red 13 darted round that final corner, his sharp claws digging deep into the wood and creating sharp splinters as he turned around and made that final dash towards the exit. He pulled away from the others, realizing that the scent was beginning to fade. He burst through the open doors like a hound out of a horror novel. He almost flew through the air above the stairs, casting his dark shadow onto the ground. When he landed, he dug his claws into the soft dirt, twisting his body round into a forced stop in front of the inn. When he stopped, he immediately raised his head to the air, trying to catch Yuffie's scent. As he had feared, the scent was no longer blowing on the wind. The wind had changed once again, taking Yuffie's scent away from him. This meant that Corneo had taken Yuffie and Elena to the northern part of the village, but without a strong scent to follow it meant that they would have to start searching for her again. There was but one scent in the air that he recognized as the wind drifted past his nose. He spotted the source of the smell running past him just a second later, black, white and red blurs rushing past his eyes. This source caused him to bare his teeth and growl fiercely, perhaps unnecessarily. Reno and Rude ignored Red 13 as they ran past, heading away from the bell tower and stopping at the top of the stairs leading to the northern part of the village. They had finally managed to pry themselves away from the bar, but only after hearing from the soldiers that Corneo had captured Elena. Red 13 narrowed his eyes and was about to make a ferocious pounce at the two Turks, when a hand suddenly swept in front of his eyes and caused him to stop. Red 13 looked up as Cloud stood next to him, wondering why the human had stopped him. Cloud looked back at Red 13 and shook his head, before looking back at the two Turks as they stood on the stairs.
That Corneo is good at escaping,
they heard Reno say. He had his arms folded irritably, his jacket and shirt blowing loosely in the wind. He looked a little annoyed, perhaps even a little concerned. Beside him, Rude's face remained expressionless, although they guessed that behind those dark shades his eyes were also anxious.
Elena,
was all he said. He looked away from Reno and glanced at the ground, his mouth creasing into a frown. Reno looked up and glanced at his partner. That was just like Rude, showing no form of emotion even when he was so obviously concerned about Elena. Not that he blamed him, Elena was smart, but even Reno was worried about her.
Let's go, Rude,
he said, sounding somewhat cheerful to lighten the mood.
We'll give them a taste of what the Turks can do.
Rude looked back down at Reno, staring at him sternly through those dark shades of his. Reno kept his expression firm, until Rude finally nodded and ran off down the stairs, leaving Reno alone. Once the Turk was gone, Reno sighed heavily, flicking his red hair out of his eyes.
Sounded pretty good,
he said. Suddenly he stopped, as he caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eyes. He turned his head a little and saw the figure moving behind him, and a somewhat devious little smirk spread on his face. He turned away again, his hand slipping underneath his blazer towards his metal rod, which was hidden there.
If Elena is in his hands, that's going to make things a little difficult,
he said.
And
Behind him Cloud slowly nodded his head, keeping his eyes firmly focused on Reno's hand. Although he didn't think Reno would attack him, considering the circumstances, he wasn't going to take any chances.
Okay,
he agreed.
Corneo took Yuffie from us. And without Yuffie, there's no way we'll get our materia back.
Reno didn't reply. His hand was still just underneath his jacket, his fingers twitching and just centimeters away from the handle of his weapon. The urge to bring it out and strike Cloud while he was so close was tempting, but Reno knew that right then there were more important things at hand. And with Cloud watching him so closely, he would not have been able to get it out fast enough.
Don't misunderstand,
he said finally, letting his hand fall casually to his side as he turned to face Cloud.
We have no intention of joining you. But for now, we'll agree not to bother each other. That's all.
That's fine, Cloud answered, just as sternly, also letting his hand fall from the handle of his blade now that Reno had moved away from his.
We have absolutely no intention of cooperating with the Turks, either.
He gave Reno a nod, and he nodded back. The two men stared at each other intently for a second or two, wondering who was going to break the silence first. Reno gave another little smirk as he folded his arms again, waiting for Cloud to ask the question he knew they needed answering. Eventually Cloud did give in, and scratched the back of his head.
Now, just what direction did Corneo run off to? Nice attitude,
replied Reno, suppressing a chuckle. He turned away from Cloud and took a few steps away down the stairs, where he stopped and looked out at Wutai.
Here's a clue,
he said.
It's the place that stands out the most.
With that, Reno then reached under his blazer and pulled out the metal rod, flicking it out to its full length and placing it on his shoulder. He then ran down the stairs, leaving Cloud behind. When he was gone, Cloud turned back to the others, whom were all waiting patiently behind him. Cloud shrugged his shoulders, and turned back to look at the village.
It's the place that stands out the most,
Reno had said. What was that supposed to mean? Up until that point, Cloud would have figured that it was the pagoda that stood out the most. It was the tallest building in the whole of Wutai, and was visible no matter where you stood in the village. It was like a beacon or a watchtower, taller than all the trees, looking after the village on its perch. And since Reno had run off to the north, he couldn't have meant the pagoda being the thing that stood out the most. So what else was there that stood out? He looked around at the village. From the top of the stairs he could see the two shops, the houses, and the turtle paradise. He could even see Yuffie's house, the biggest house in Wutai. Even from there it still looked like a normal house, nothing special that made it stand out above the rest. Then, as Cloud looked around, his eyes slowly moved eastward. They moved towards the very far east of the village, to where the item shop stood. Behind the shop he could see a very rocky path, winding up slowly past the village. He followed its line upwards, and a look of realization set in as he finally saw the place that stood out the most. Cloud almost kicked himself for his stupidity. He should have realized it sooner, for it really was the place that stood out more than anything else. What else was more obvious than a large, rocky cliff standing alongside a village? What could be more visible than a huge structure made of stone, carved into that cliff, looking down at the village? Sure enough, Reno and Rude were still waiting for them by the time Cloud and the rest of his group finally arrived at the rocky entrance of Dajao, the sacred mountain of Wutai. They were waiting somewhat impatiently, as Reno was pacing across the ground, kicking at the dirt and lightly smacking his metal rod against the rocks. Rude was probably the more patient of the two, but of course no one could see his expression behind his shades. As Cloud and the others began to run up the path towards the two, Reno stopped his pacing and looked up.
"You're finally here,"
he called down to them as they approached. Even so, he was somewhat surprised that they had figured out his riddle so fast. Maybe they were smarter than they looked. No one answered Reno right away. They just came to a stop at the top of the path, trying hard not to show their fatigue from having run non-stop right through the village just to reach this spot. When they all caught their breath, they looked at Reno, waiting for him to tell them more about Corneo's whereabouts. Reno seemed to realize this, as he shook his head and pointed to the mountain behind them.
"We're gonna split into two,"
he explained briefly to them.
"You do whatever you want. But don't endanger Elena."
He seemed to stress that remark quite firmly, before turning and walking away up the mountain path. After a few steps he stopped again, remembering something, and glanced back at Cloud.
"Don't worry. We won't do anything to that girl, Yuffie. For now,"
he added with a sneer. Reno then nodded to Rude. Rude nodded silently back, and the two Turks then ran off up the mountain path into the depths of Dajao, leaving Cloud and the others behind at the entrance. With the two Turks gone, Cloud and the others were left to search the mountain alone. There was no point asking Reno for any other clues, they probably didn't know where Corneo was hiding either. Not that they would ever admit to that. The Turks cared a lot about their appearance, and having one of their company kidnapped must have been very embarrassing for them. There were a number of winding paths surrounding the statue of Dajao. The path they were on now was the main path, rising up to the bottom of the main stone figure at the center of the congregation. From this point the statue looked very large and domineering, casting its dark shadow onto them as the late afternoon sun began to set in. They moved on steadily up the stone path. About halfway up the statue the path split into many different directions, acting like a spider's web that wound itself around the statues of Dajao. They could see Reno and Rude, running in different directions in their search for Elena and Corneo. At one point during their search they passed Rude as he stood thoughtfully outside a small, darkened cave, before making up his mind and running into the darkness. After about 5 minutes of searching, the party came to a stop on one of the stone paths. They were high above the ground now, almost alongside the head of the main Dajao statue. It was hopeless. The statues of Dajao were just too big and too winding for them to search thoroughly. There were many hidden nooks and crannies, so many different places that Corneo could use to hide himself, Yuffie and Elena. Even with the Turks on their side, there was only so much that they could do.
"This is hopeless,"
Sid shouted suddenly, throwing his spear harshly onto the ground.
"They could be anywhere by now. I tell ya, that girl's more trouble than she's worth."
No one disagreed with him. If Yuffie hadn't taken their materia in the first place, then they wouldn't be wasting precious time searching for her. They were meant to be looking for the Temple of the Ancients, not chasing her. Sid was right, she was more trouble than she was worth, but they needed their materia. While everyone took this moment to take a quick rest and catch their breath, Vincent walked away from the group and headed further down the path. He didn't go very far because the path came to an end, sweeping to the left as it joined up with the arm of one of the statues. He looked out at the village for a second or two, until a sound caught his ear and he looked to his left. He raised an eyebrow at what he saw, and then called Cloud over to look. Yuffie struggled with all of her might, desperately trying to break free of the ropes that bound her to the wall. The knots were fixed tight, tied securely to metal hoops attached to a metal plate forced onto the front of the statue. If she pulled too hard, she would most likely pull the loop free altogether and fall to her death. But even that was better than hanging like bait against the wall. She had been tied up and positioned over one of the eyes of the statue of Dajao. Elena was beside her, tied up like she was, across the other eye of the statue, although she wasn't struggling. The ground was a long way beneath them, and to fall from this height would mean certain death. So, as undignified as it was, she kept as still as possible and avoided struggling. Unlike Yuffie.
"Let me go,"
Safely on the ground in front of them, Don Corneo strolled leisurely across the open stone palm of the hand of Dejao. That same manic grin was still on his face as he gazed up adoringly at the two tied-up women. He seemed to get some strange pleasure out of seeing the two tied there, and made no effort to hide it.
Delicious. Scrumptious.
He exclaimed gleefully, clapping his hands together in sheer excitement.
I think I've just found a new hobby. Which shall it be?
He moved over towards the end of Dechao's hand, and looked up at Elena.
Should I go with her?
Elena stared blankly at him for a second. When realization set in, her eyes opened wide in horror and she looked physically sick.
Hey, I'm one of the Turks.
She protested fiercely.
Don't think you can get away with this.
Corneo ignored Elena. Either that or he was just so wrapped up in his own delusional fantasy that he never even heard her. He licked his lips in delight, and quickly waddled over to the other end of the hand, this time choosing to gaze up at the tied-up ninja.
Or maybe her.
Yuffie narrowed her eyes angrily at Corneo, feeling just as sick as Elena was.
Oh, God.
She cursed loudly, increasing the momentum of her wriggling as she tried desperately to break free of the bonds that held her to the wall.
If I knew this was gonna happen, I would have taken rope escape lessons more seriously.
She gave her arms a hefty tug, but the metal loops were firmer than they looked, and did not break free. She gave another loud curse and hit her head against the wall. While the girl was busy struggling with her shackles, Corneo continued to move his eyes from one girl to the other. He seemed to take each girl into careful consideration, letting his eyes wander up and down their tied-up bodies. A dozen thoughts were running through his head. When they finally came together, his eyes lit up. He had come to a decision.
I've made my choice,
he announced, speaking loudly so that the two girls, and anyone else in the area, could hear him.
My companion for the night will be...
He let that sentence hang in the air for a moment, an imaginary drum roll beating loudly through his head. When he heard the unreal clash of the cymbals in his mind, he raised his arms up and stood before Yuffie.
The cheerful one. Grossness,
Yuffie said in reply, her entire body convulsing from the sheer thought of what Corneo had in mind. She opened her eyes and glared down at the man angrily, wishing she could rip that idiotic smile of his off of his face.
Don't mess with me, old man. You don't even have any materia.
Again Corneo seemed to disregard what she had said, interpreting her words into a meaning that only he could think of. He began to jump up and down on the ground, acting like a little boy who was being given candy for the very first time, tasting its sweet, sugary flavor.
And she's saucy, too,
he said, ecstatically.
We. All right, that's it.
End of chapter. Episode 18, Part 07, Chapter 18. Chapter 18. Corneo stopped jumping up and down, and quickly turned to face the path behind him. For an instant there was a look of fear and panic in his eyes, for a moment wondering if he was in any danger.
Hee-haw. What? What's going on?
He demanded.
Who's there?
He looked further up the path, and jumped back for a second time as he saw Cloud and his party running down the arm of Dejao towards him. He backed up onto the very edge of the path, beside a small, metallic structure that was embedded in the rock. While he looked scared to see Cloud and the others approaching him, Yuffie looked extremely relieved.
Oh man! Cloud!
Yuffie called out desperately. Never in her life had she been so glad to see the spiky-haired ex-soldier. Beside her, Elena also sighed with relief, equally relieved to see Cloud and the others come to their rescue. She would have preferred Tseng or the other Turks, but as long as she was rescued from this predicament, she didn't care who saved her.
We!
Corneo exclaimed gleefully.
Long time no see.
He said it a little cautiously, as though he wasn't entirely sure whether he had seen them before. Cloud raised an eyebrow at the estranged man, and folded his arms.
Don't tell me you forgot,
he said in disbelief.
That fall into the trap really hurt.
Tifa shouted angrily, clenching her fists tightly. She was of course referring to the trap that Corneo had tricked them into back in Midgar, delaying their return to Sector 7 in time to stop the support pillar from being destroyed. They had managed to squeeze the information they needed out of him, but he was as slippery as an eel and had a backup plan ready.
You just don't get it, do you?
Eris shouted, just as angry as Tifa was. Their minds were both fixed on all of the innocent people who had been crushed to death when the Sector 7 plate came crashing down. It was because of Corneo that had happened. Because he had told the Shinra that Avalanche was based in Sector 7. Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse were only a few of those many innocents. Don Corneo didn't look very sympathetic.
Be quiet.
He snapped instead, silencing them all.
None of you know how much I've suffered since then.
He turned away from them.
It's a long story, but we don't want to hear it,
said Tifa.
Just let the two go.
Don Corneo turned back to face the group. So he did remember them after all. The Shinra had found out about him telling Cloud and the others about their plans to destroy the pillar, and since then Corneo had been on the run, fearing for his life. He had run from Midgar to Calm, across the ocean to Costa del Sol, and finally ended up in Wutai where he thought he would be safe. Until the Turks got involved, and he ended up on the run again.
You guys are
serious, he said, looking from one person to another. He eyed over their wide selection of weaponry, and was clever enough to notice the complete lack of materia. A sly smile widened on his face.
Good, good. This ain't no time for me to be fooling around either. Why did you kill my little APS? I'm gonna make you play with my new pet, so you won't be getting in the way of my search for a bride.
He turned to the cliff.
Raps, come here.
A loud and high-pitched screech suddenly came from the ground beneath them, and the heavy beating of flapping wings could be heard. All at once everyone's hands rushed to their weapons, instantly ready to fight off anything that Corneo was about to throw at them. Cloud reached behind him and drew his buster sword, holding the handle firmly in his hands. He was not worried about what kind of creature Corneo would set against them. Last time Corneo had underestimated their ability to kill APS, his sewer monster, and it was more than likely that he would underestimate them again. Even without their materia, he had every confidence that they would defeat this new beast with ease. The sound of rushing wings got louder, and a dark red blur suddenly zipped up from the ground below, heading up to the sky. As the creature rose it screeched again, flapping its thick, leathery wings as it rose up into the sky. As Cloud had expected, Corneo had underestimated them. Raps, as he called the creature, was nothing more than a simple aerial dragon, and not even a fully grown one at that. At full size and strength the dragon would cause them problems, especially since they had no materia. This dragon was about half the size it should have been, with a long, thin, spiky snout and a small spike at the end of its long tail. It would cause no problems at all. Reno was still searching at that moment. He had searched the eastern side of the statue, looking into every hidden cave that he could see, and was now heading back towards the west side to meet up with Rude. He could not see Cloud and his party anymore, and it disgusted him to think that he had to team up with them in order to get Elena back safely. As he was walking across one of the upper paths, he suddenly heard a loud and angry screech echo up from the ground below. He stopped in the middle of the path and looked down in time to see a dark red and purple dragon fly up from below. The sound of gunfire could then be heard, and the dragon circled rapidly. However, Reno was ignoring the dragon. He had spotted something much more important standing on the hand near to where the dragon had arisen. He could see the small, rounded figure of Don Corneo, jumping up and down in excitement, calling out to his draconic pet in glee as it circled and avoided the gunfire. Reno let a small smile appear briefly on his face, before he began to walk across the path again. Raps gave another ear-shattering screech as another bullet pierced the thin flesh of its body. The bullet shot straight through to the other end, pushing out of the monster's back and into the air. There were more bleeding bullet wounds all across its body, dark green blood pouring from its chest and stomach, and even pouring like tears from its eyes. Its speed had been a great advantage in this battle, allowing it to dive in fast strokes. The monster dived again, making one final attempt to get at least one of its prey off the ledge. It tilted its wounded wings and dived, trying to pass the ledge on the eastern side. The dragon approached, and Sid pushed past Tifa and ran across the path towards the junction where the dragon would pass. Vincent managed to jump aside as the dragon swept in, firing a good few bullets from his gun as it passed. He stopped firing as Sid jumped past him and off the ledge, his spear high above his head as he prepared to bring it down onto the creature. His aim was perfect. He landed on the creature's back as it flew past the ledge, and instantly brought his spear down. The sharp spear pierced through the flesh with ease, its thin point splicing through until it came out of the other end, narrowly missing the creature's erratically beating heart. Sid hung on with all his might, keeping the spear still as the dragon screeched and thrashed its wings in a panic. Already it was beginning to drop in height, the blood loss and pain from the spear beginning to take its toll. Pretty soon it was beginning to drop dramatically, heading towards the ground. At the last second Sid withdrew his spear and leapt from the creature's back, landing back on the ledge without a scratch. Raps meanwhile, was dead even before he hit the ground. As he fell towards the rocky chasm below, his eyes slid shut, passing quietly into death before his body could hit the rocks. No one watched him land. All Don Corneo could do was watch and stare as his beloved Raps crashed onto the ground, falling into a rugged heap on the floor. His jaw hung open in disbelief, unable to believe that his dragon had been defeated. When he looked up at last, he saw the fixed gazes of the party staring at him intently, and he quickly turned white as he realized that he was next.
"Wait,"
he said quickly, waving his arms madly in front of him.
"Just wait a second."
Cloud shook his head, his sword sharp and ready in his hands.
"Shut up,"
he commanded. He had had enough of Corneo's attempts to waste their time, and he had had pretty much enough of this pointless escapade.
"Just listen to me, it won't take long,"
Corneo said earnestly, desperate to buy time for himself. He was backing up onto the ledge again, his hands slowly edging towards the peculiar metal object hidden in the ground.
"Why do you think a bad guy like me would swallow his pride and plead for his life? 1. Because he's ready to die. 2. Because he's sure to win. 3. Because he's clueless."
Cloud rolled his eyes. He knew Corneo was just stalling for time, trying to think of some way he could save his own pathetic hide.
3,
he answered finally, deciding to humor him for a little while. Corneo sniggered.
"Clothes, but no cigar."
Before anyone could react, Corneo quickly spun round and pulled on the metal object behind him. It was actually a remote lever that he had quickly set up when he tied Yuffie and Elena to the statue, and it was connected to the metal plates that they were tied onto. As he pulled the lever, the mechanism whirred. Seconds later, the metal plates began to slowly turn, and Yuffie and Elena turned along with them. By the time the plates stopped turning, the two women were hanging upside down on the plates, pointing headfirst into the rocky chasm where Raps lay dead. Elena had closed her eyes while the metal plates had turned, but as they had stopped she slowly opened her eyes. She found herself looking straight down into the chasm, which looked much closer now she was upside down.
"Ay-ay-ay-ay!"
she screamed in fright, closing her eyes again. Beside her, Yuffie was furious.
"Makes me so mad!"
she snarled angrily. She continued to wriggle even though she was upside down, but nevertheless she still could not break free of the ropes.
"If I push this button,"
Corneo was saying, as Cloud and the others all gasped and stared at the two hanging women.
"They'll fall upside down, and we'll have a squashed tomatoes."
No one bothered to correct his grammatical error. Cloud turned and glared at Corneo through fierce blue eyes, trying to see any sign that he might have been bluffing. Yet there was no sign in Corneo's eyes that said to him that he was lying, and he really meant to drop the women. If he were to drop Yuffie and Elena from this height, they would surely be killed the moment they hit the rocks.
"Damn!"
he cursed, knowing that they could not make any form of attack as long as Yuffie and Elena were pointing into the chasm. They were now at Corneo's mercy. Tifa curled her lip as she looked at Corneo angrily.
"Coward,"
she said. Corneo did not seem to care much about her insult. He was smiling now, all the memory of Raps completely wiped from his mind. His anguish had now been replaced by the sheer thrill of excitement that came with the knowledge that he had once again got the better of the group.
"Now, give me your women too,"
he ordered them sternly, the manic grin of enthusiasm returning to his face. He saw Cloud's angry glare, and laughed.
"Ha, ha, ha, ha. I guess I'm the one laughing last." "No, that would be us." "Hee-haw. What?"
Corneo asked, opening his eyes and looking around.
"What's going on? Who's there?"
He looked up past Cloud and the others, and his eyes opened wide into a true expression of fear as he saw Reno walking down the path behind Cloud and his party. Although he didn't recognize Reno individually, he recognized the trademark uniform. That blue uniform was the designated uniform of a Turk. He had dismissed the uniform as mere chance with Elena, but now that Reno had arrived he was truly afraid.
"The Turks,"
he said. Reno did not respond. He calmly walked past Cloud and the others, ignoring their gazes as they followed him across the path. He came to a stop on the thumb of the statue, and flicked his hair out of his eyes. Then he looked at Corneo.
You knew this was gonna happen ever since you leaked that secret, he said. We're going to take care of you. Personally. Damn it.
Corneo shouted, those words cutting into his heart more than Cloud's sword ever could. He feared the Turks far more than he could ever fear Cloud and his group. His entire body was trembling.
Then they're all going with me.
He shouted, and turned to push the button beside the lever. Before his hand could get anywhere near the button, a black blur suddenly zipped through the air. It struck Corneo in his side, and the man staggered forward in surprise, trying to maintain his balance. He staggered all the way to the edge of the cliff, and waved his arms frantically to keep from falling over. He lost the battle for balance and tumbled over, his hands grabbing onto the edge. There he hung, holding on for dear life. Reno smiled and looked up at Rude, who was standing on another path at the back of the statue.
Good timing, Rude,
he said. Rude adjusted his shades and slowly nodded his head.
Let's get to work,
he said simply. Reno nodded in agreement, and walked carefully down from the thumb and towards the spot where Corneo was hanging. He looked down at the hanging man for a second or two, before bringing his foot down on Corneo's hand. Corneo cried out as he felt the firm leather crushing his hand. If Reno were to release him now, he would fall to his death.
All right, Corneo,
Reno said sternly, leaning over to look Corneo in the eye.
This'll be over quick, so listen up. Why do you think we went to all the trouble of teaming up with those guys to get you? 1. Because we were ready to die. 2. Because we were sure of victory. 3. Because we were clueless.
Corneo tried to think of which was the right answer. It was hard to think because he was hanging from the edge of a cliff, but he eventually understood enough to answer.
2. Number 2.
Reno shook his head.
All wrong.
Corneo's eyes widened in fear.
No. Wait, Stow.
Reno then lifted his foot, and Corneo slipped from the edge.
P.
No one watched him land. The only clue to his demise was the fading of his last scream, followed by the heavy thud as his body hit the ground. Eris flinched as she heard that thud, and turned her head away. Corneo may have been a sick man, but this was another reminder that the Turks were not to be messed with. When the final echoes of Corneo's dying thud had died away, Reno turned away from the cliff edge and closed his eyes.
The correct answer was...
he began.
Because it's our job,
finished Rude. Reno opened his eyes again and nodded at his partner, satisfied that they had completed their mission. Meanwhile, Elena was still hanging upside down from the statue.
Oh, thank you very much.
She called out to them, the gratitude clearly audible in her voice and visible on her face.
I never expected you to come help.
Reno snapped his head around and looked up at Elena, glaring at her through narrowed eyes.
Elena, don't act so weak,
he told her sternly.
You're a Turk. Why? Yes, sir.
Elena replied. Reno smiled and shook his head, secretly relieved that Elena was all right.
Thanks for your help,
said Eris. Rude muttered silently, turning his head away from them. Reno was about to say something more, but right then a loud ringing sound suddenly began to buzz from inside his pocket. He turned away from the group and pulled the cell phone out of his pocket, flipping it open and putting it to his ear.
Yes. This is Reno,
he answered, listening to the voice on the other end.
Yes.
He glanced over at Rude and nodded his head slightly. Rude seemed to understand what Reno meant in that nod, and folded his arms.
Yes. I'll get on it right away.
He flicked the phone off, and slipped it back into his pocket.
Was that the company?
Asked Elena. Reno nodded.
Yeah, they want us to find Cloud.
He turned back around to face Cloud and the others, who were all still standing silently behind them. Cloud narrowed his eyes and quickly put his hand to his sword again, ready to fight them if necessary. To his utmost surprise, Reno made no move to draw his weapon, which was clearly visible underneath his jacket. Nor did Rude make any move to jump over to them, even though he could make the jump easily. In fact, neither of the Turks made any move to attack them. Reno just stared at Cloud intently, saying nothing.
Are we on?
Asked Rude, breaking the silence. Reno stared at Cloud a few seconds more, before glancing at Reno.
No, today we're off duty.
He looked back at Cloud and nodded reassuringly. For a moment Cloud wondered whether or not to believe him, but then he relaxed his hand, leaving his sword behind his back. He would give the Turks the benefit of the doubt this time.
Hey, who cares about any of that?
Came Yuffie's angry voice, as she was still hanging upside down from the mountain.
Get me down.
Now back in Yuffie's house, Yuffie leapt around the room, darting from one person to another as she slipped the materia back into the slots of the weapons and armor. Her hands moved like lightning, zipping in and out of the brown bag where the materia was stored, pushing it into an available slot before jumping to the next person. She didn't take note of who got what materia, what was important was that she was finally giving the materia back at last.
Phew, perfect,
the young ninja said, as she finished putting in the last piece of materia into Barrett's gun arm.
Now the materia is back in its rightful place. Hey,
Cloud said, looking down at the amulet around his wrist and his blade.
The placement of it is all messed up.
Yuffie sidled over and looked over Cloud's shoulder. Sure enough, Cloud had a completely different set of materia from what he was used to. Instead of lightning, he had ice, and instead of the Ramu materia, he had Choco/Mog, as well as the Cure materia.
Hey,
Yuffie said. She tapped the materia gently with her finger, and then shrugged.
Oh, it'll be all right. Don't be so picky. Anyways, that sure was close. Now, normally I would kick their butts. Boom, bang.
She began to punch and kick the air, acting as though she was beating Corneo and his dragon pet to a pulp with her bare hands, swiping her shuriken across the air. Everyone watched and stared at her as she did her little show. They couldn't believe that she was acting as though nothing had ever happened. If it hadn't been for her, they would never have had to go through all that in the first place. Yuffie's ego really was something to be trifled with. Cloud looked over at Tifa, Vincent, and Katshi, and they nodded.
That Corneo guy's a real pain,
Yuffie was saying. She had turned away from the whole group now, standing at the far end of the living room. She was oblivious to the silent conversation going on behind her, the way Cloud turned to the other side of the room and nodded at the rest of the group.
I'd rather deal with my dad than deal with that guy. Oh, by the way, some of those guys from the Turks are good, hey? At least, after all that, we got the materia back. Now come on everybody, let's continue our journey.
At that point she finally turned around, and jumped as she saw that she was standing alone in the room. The others had all left, walking out while she was in the middle of her rant about the materia.
Hey!
Yuffie called out angrily, realizing that she had been left behind.
Wait. Oh, alright. Here, I'll give this to you guys. Here, look, look.
She jumped up and waved a single piece of materia in the air, the piece that she had snatched from Cloud's hands in the item shop.
Come on, wait. No matter what anyone says, I'm going with you.
She lowered her arm and looked down at the glimmering ball of materia resting in her hands. After a second or two she closed her fist around it, and quietly slipped it back into her pocket.
Next time,
she said, before running out of the house after the others. End of chapter.